Indeed. Welcome, everyone. Let's start. Today's session is entitled Causality, full stop. And we're probably not going to solve all the questions, but we will continue from where we left last time when John Ginn and Brian Castellani spoke about the differences and similarities between synthetic and semantic structures. So when one talks about those things, of course, it brings into focus questions about causality. And on the face of it, causality appears very straightforward, really simple. Something causes something else. For example, people joining the seminar series are on average happier than people who don't join the seminar series. Now, beyond such simplistic accounts, however, things are much more complicated. We won't solve all those questions today, of course, if ever, but it can still be extremely useful to unpack the concept more. And we will do this today via our two panelists, one following a more theoretical approach, one following a route that is deeply embedded in empirical work. The rules of the game today are pretty straightforward. We will invite every panelist to give a 5 to 7 minute statement regarding the main topic. And then there will be opportunity to ask questions for clarifications after each statement. And after that, we will open the floor for a group discussion. And you may open the door if you want to. So with that out of the way, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who's Federica Russo. And I'm not quite sure how much of an introduction she actually needs, because she was the driving force of behind the Causality seminar series that gave birth to the current series. But still, so for your background information, she's a philosopher of science and technology at the University of Amsterdam, and her work focuses on the epistemological, methodological, and normative aspects of research in the context of social science and technology. She has taught this topic, causality, to students for a long time, and also organizing the previous seminar series. I'm quite sure she has plenty of fascinating things to say. So, Federica, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So let me first share my screen. So now you can't see much, but in a second you should be able to see it. Can you see the presentation? Yes?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. So what can I say? Thanks you for the generous presentation, Lasse. It is kind of exciting and also a bit frightening to be a speaker in your own seminar series, especially when the organizer put the bar so high, in part because of the personal expectations of Lasse to end the week on a cheerful and interesting note, but mainly because, I mean, I've been studying and working on causality for plus 15 years, and I'm asked to say something in less than 7 minutes, so go me in trying to say something that is sensible and useful at the same time. But to avoid the kind of pitfall of Pascal that because he couldn't make a short letter, he made a long one not to have the time, I decided to be very, very disciplined and follow the instructions. So why are we talking about causality? In part, I think it is exactly what Lasse said, because when we talk about syntactic and semantic structures, this is where you go. But for me, I guess there is also a more a question that is kind of more laden in the very conceptualization of our methods. And the idea is that most likely different methods work with different ways of conceptualizing causes and causality. And so I had this recurrent question in my mind over the years, whether these different questions, these different ways of conceptualizing causality ultimately remain irreducible, or there is a possible reconciliation. And if you have so many, why is it so? I mean, don't you need, after all, one concept that unifies everything? But these are really huge questions. And so what I did was really being disciplined and doing my homework. So what you see in the second part of the slide is a selection of the questions that Sophia and Lasse prepared for us, the panelists. So one question is, can we approximate or even uncover causality, or should we stay away from such attempts? Second question that I picked is, what methods would you consider more accurate in demonstrating causality than others? And further, somehow provocative questions, were the social constructivists correct all along? Okay, so each of these questions would be really, would take very long to address, but I thought I would like to share some thoughts of how at least I try and approach these questions. So there you go. To me, the core of the answer lies in pluralism. What is this pluralism about? So my first answer is what you see in yellow. Yes, we can uncover causal relations. It doesn't mean that we always manage to uncover causal relations, but we can uncover them even in fields such as the social sciences, where we think we have much less of a grip on causal relations. And yes, we do need different methods, and I will elaborate on these two aspects in a minute. Second point, no, I don't think that there is an intrinsic hierarchy of methods. Most likely, we may come up with a number of hierarchies, and how you come up with different hierarchies depends on the purpose of a model. So what I would argue against is any rigid and absolute hierarchy of methods. And I would like instead to understand how we may have to order methods depending on what a model has to do for you. So the research question and the purpose of the model are really essential elements to decide what works better or worse depending on what you want to do. And the third answer to the answer to the third question is, well, the constructivists were partly right, just as the realists are or have been. Okay, so these are my short answers. So let me now give you a bit more of details on each of these three short answers. Now, how do I argue in favor of methodological pluralism, and how does this connect with conceptual pluralism? So yes, we may need, so we do need a concept of cause, but this cannot be rigid or monolithic. I think I did mention earlier on in the series foliated pluralism, which is the approach of philosopher Stéphanie Ruffi. And this is the idea that with different methods, we really get epistemic access to an object from various perspectives. So we do need this diversity. In terms of the hierarchies, so the question of the hierarchy is really ill-posed. As I said, you have to put the purpose of method really explicitly and at the center of the discussion. And this is key to establish healthy dialogue across different traditions and methods. And lastly, a note about constructivism and realism. So both views are really trapped in the dichotomy that there is us and the world, and this is something that came up in the seminar series already, that there is instead a triad of relations. There is us, the world, the instruments, and the instruments include the methods. So causality is out there in the world, but is also in our head, in the way we conceptualize causality and how we operationalize it. And the difficulty is exactly to articulate this middle position. And earlier on, it was suggesting, and I totally agree, that some approaches like Karen Barad and her form of materialism can be really helpful here. So this is my final point. What is the core of causal pluralism then? Not to pin down the one concept of causality, but to articulate a meaning, operationalization, and use of causal concepts across domains, not to establish rigid hierarchies, but again, to articulate which methods are to be synergistically used for what purpose, and not to claim that the world is governed by causal law, rigid, universal, blah, 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 but really to articulate why we need to understand the world with causal concepts. And so if you want to know how to be a causal pluralist in practice, you may want to have a look at a few things that I have done. And there is also a short video in which I presented this approach of causal pluralism that comes from the Causality series. And I apologize for this shameless self-promotion, but I think at some point I had to feel like, oh, what I have done over the years makes sense, because it was a framework that really spoke to people across domains. And I took it 1 minute longer than what I was allowed. Thanks for your patience, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Federica. And I think the plugging, I think you're entitled to plug some of your work, so no worries about that. There's a short opportunity for people to ask some questions for clarification to Federica before we move to the second panelist. Are there any quick questions right now? There cannot be quick questions because there will be long questions. Okay, then we'll move then now to the second panelist before we open the floor for the discussion. And the second panelist of today is Wouter Spekkink, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Public Administration at the Erasmus University here in Rotterdam, after having kicked off his work at the University of Manchester. Wouter specializes in graph theoretical methodologies for the investigation and tracing of complex social processes, and he's even gone so far and developed dedicated software for this. Now, when one traces social processes, one is forced to make causal claims of whatever kind. I'm happy to see how that pans out against what Federica just said. So how easy that is, or how difficult it is to do that, is something that Wouter will tell us right now. So Wouter, please go ahead.
Sure. I want to share my screen, but it says that the host disabled that.
For good reasons. No, I'm kidding. Federica, could you, because I also cannot.
It's done, now you can, I think. Try again.
Okay, yes. Yes, now it works. So you'll first see yourselves, I think, or maybe not. Let's see. Can you see? Oh, I need to.
We see the slides. We see the slides.
Yeah, and do you see? You still see them?
We still see them.
Good. Okay. So thanks for the introduction. I also was very much in doubt what angle exactly to take, and I decided to take something quite specific, but it's something I came across quite often in doing this. You know, based on this interest in studying social processes, I sort of take a lot of inspiration from, you could say, a set of methods that Andrew Abbott referred to as positivist narrativism, or narrative positivism. That's it. So it's kind of like process methods developed from the perspective of people who are used to doing very positivist research. And I know there's an interesting discussion going on there, I guess, about causality and the use of causal mechanisms in making causal claims. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. So I'm going to briefly discuss a quite common approach to causal analysis that maybe not everyone here agrees with, but it's something that's quite common in the fields that I work in, and I hope not too controversial for many. So very simply, there's an assumption there that you do causal inference through ideally experimental research or otherwise large and observational studies, and I will mostly be talking about the latter. So very simply, in experimental studies, to establish that there is a cause, you would, to establish the causal effect of something, you would study a case with the causal effect present and with a treatment basically, and in the absence of treatment, to establish whether that cause has actually has a certain effect. Well, in many cases or in many studies, it's not possible to use this experimental method, right? We cannot observe many cases in the absence or in the presence of a treatment and control for everything else to be equal. So we often use a kind of statistical sleight of hand where we just compare many cases, some of which are in the condition that we want to check for, and some of which aren't. And we sort of assume that these cases are homogeneous in most other respects, so that based on that statistical study, we can determine whether a certain variable has a causal effect on an outcome variable. So, I mean, it's kind of a very brief introduction to a more complex topic, obviously, but I think this should be familiar mostly to many of you. So basically, you know, causes and effects are then measured as variables, but very often we are not satisfied with just that, you know, the establishment of that correlation in this large N observational study, because correlation is not exactly the same as causation. You know, many things correlate, but are not causally related to each other. So what very often then people do is to also propose a certain mechanism that connects these two variables, like the variable that is supposed to be the cause and the variable that's supposed to be the outcome. We propose a causal mechanism and attempt to demonstrate that this causal mechanism is indeed operating in certain cases. And that's often through case studies. So we pick certain cases from our larger data set and we try to establish that this causal mechanism is operational. And a very popular label for this kind of approach nowadays is process tracing. I think it's quite common. A common mixed methodology is to first do this correlational study and then engage in process tracing to establish that a causal mechanism is indeed operational. But we get quite weird about causality once we make this step towards case studies. And this is kind of where the puzzles that I ran into come up. So one thing that I find quite weird, if you take this very popular process tracing approach, for example, so that's, you're looking for a mechanism, right? So that's basically something that connects the cause to the outcome. And they make these funny statements about what these mechanisms are. So these mechanisms themselves are not causes, but are causal processes that are triggered by causes and that then link them with outcomes in a productive relationship. But then they never really make clear what this productive relationship is, right? It's still things sort of connected in a chain. And to me, it sounds a lot like what others would refer to like a causal sequence of events, because, you know, what are the connections between this chain? This productive relationship sounds like a kind of semantic trick to avoid talking about causes, you know, within a causal mechanism. Another way to look at it is, this is from someone who, Roberts tried to sort of figure out how historians make causal claims. So he's not prescribing anything, he's trying to explain how historians do it already. And he says basically that it comes down to micro correlation. So, you know, like in process tracing, we trace certain outcomes to sequences of events and eventually to a certain cause. And we connect these steps in a sequence with what he in his opinion, we always use covering laws. So something based on constant conjunction. Right, observing a certain relationship in many different cases, and he says, well, historians do this basically, so they make connections between the steps in the sequence. They do it often. They often do it implicitly, but basically they are subsuming these connections under covering laws. But to me, that sounds like then you're back at square one, because how do you justify those covering laws, right? So for me. I don't know if you follow, but for me, that sounds a little bit like you're going in circles, because you're trying to explain a macro correlation then by tracing a causal sequence, but then you have to explain the causal sequence again by these correlations. So just to make the problem a little bit visual, this was actually made by with the software that Lasse briefly mentioned, right? So we have a cause, we have an effect. We think there's a kind of a sequence of events that links the two. But what then accounts for these links, right? What kind of evidence do we provide for that? How do we convince someone that these links themselves are there? And there's one kind of interesting attempt that I found, well, at least that sort of intrigues me, by Peter Abel. He tried to find a way out of this. He's really a positivist, and he tried to come up with this idea of singular causality, based on what he calls contingent practical syllogisms. And basically that's an attempt to explain to make singular causal claims based on often intentions of actors. So if you say a certain actor intended to realize a certain change in events, or he intended to achieve a certain situation, and he believed by doing something he could achieve that situation, therefore he did it, then you can make the claim, okay, this situation was achieved by this actor because he believed he could. I mean, there's a lot of things to discuss about this, a lot of nuances that I cannot go into now because of the, you know, we don't really have the time for that. But that's what his proposal for making singular causal claims. And using a kind of similar approach, what he calls interactive contingent practical syllogisms, you could also make an argument like some other actor did something because an earlier actor, did something else. And then you make these sort of paths of causal connections that lead from the final cause to the outcome. But then a lot just comes down to providing evidence that, for example, these actors did indeed do something because someone else did that other thing. And it very much comes down to kind of trying to make your case in court, right? You're just trying to provide evidence that convinces your audience that these links actually exist for that reason. And Abel goes as far to use Bayesian statistics to also express the sort of margins of uncertainty around those claims. But yeah, I mean, I find this intriguing, but for me, this is also still kind of like it feels like an unsatisfactory conclusion or a solution. So I just end with some food for discussion based on, on this exploration of ideas that I've sort of done over the years. So, one thing that I observe is that causal explanations in social sciences often assume some kind of comparison between cases, one in which, some in which the cause is present and cases in which it is not. So that makes it quite difficult. That's, I think, the main problem that makes it so difficult to make causal claims within single cases. Also, when you're tracing causal mechanisms. And causal explanations also assume this chain of events, right? So because we want to go beyond just establishing correlations, we also need to often account for the causal mechanism that leads from the cause to the effect. But we struggle to justify the links within this chain itself, right? That's where a lot of this debate comes up. And most solutions that I have come across, to me, they feel unsatisfactory. So I think that productive relationships thing is a bit of a semantic trick. Or referring again to covering laws, I think that sort of leads to circular reasoning. And just in practice, I often find myself just trying to provide evidence as if I'm presenting my case in a court. I'm just trying to convince people that something happened because of something else that happened before. And very often this evidence is also to some extent circumstantial. So I feel kind of unsatisfied with how far we've gotten with this so far. But maybe our discussion here can lead to some new insights on this. So let me stop sharing my screen. I hope my rant was a little bit clear.
It totally was. Thank you so much, Wouter. Are there any quick questions for clarification for Wouter before we do the group discussion? I may have one myself, Wouter. When you talk about those, when you talk about the authors that you refer to, in particular Abel, I'm wondering to what extent are they or is he interested in finding general laws, or would it still be case dependent?
He is interested in finding general laws. So he's really, like I said, a positivist, and he sort of says that normally when you do causal analysis, you start with a comparative method. And then what is the other thing? Well, there's like 3 steps. So it starts with comparison. I forgot the middle step, but then in the 3rd step, that's where you achieve an explanation. And he sort of tries to reverse that. Right, so he says, let's start from a singular cause, a singular explanation. The 2nd step was generalization. And he says, and then we generalize, and then we compare in other cases. So he's trying to make the arguments towards a very positivist audience, because that's where he feels at home. That's also where he feels his debates should take place. Basically reversing that sequence of steps, but in the end also to establish covering laws from the bottom up, basically. Yeah.
Did he find them?
I don't think so, because if you look at his later work, more and more, so what he invests in mostly now is this part about how to provide convincing evidence. And he hooked up a lot with ethnographers, for example, and he got really into this idea of Bayesian statistics to sort of, in my opinion, it's a little bit attaching numbers to things that are in the end very arbitrary. But what the positive thing about it is, he tries to make explicit how certain are we about certain evidence. But I think you know, that estimate that you give is always a little bit, I don't know, it feels like trying to put things into numbers that are really hard to put into numbers in the end. But that's, you know, his main topic at the moment. So I don't know if he still worries too much about his attempt to, you know, come to covering laws based on this approach. I don't think he ever has, no.
Thank you so much, Wouter. And I really like the fact that when you talk about putting arbitrary numbers to observations, that other QCA people start nodding like, oh, yep, we recognize that. Very good. Thanks, both of you. Now, I would like to open the floor to everyone to ask any question, or provoke the speakers perhaps in some ways. Are there questions at the moment?
Yes, hello, my name is Bas Arts from Wageningen University and the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency. I have a question to Federica, but first of all, thank you so much for both presentations, very interesting. I'm also trying to establish some kind of mixed method approach in terms of impact assessment. But all the time you then have this discussion about commensurability and incommensurability. And I was wondering, because you, Federica, you said something about causal pluralism, and that sounds a bit similar than my own seeking for mixed method impact assessment. How you deal with that argument?
Yeah, so I really started from a pluralistic approach to both methodology and causality. The first way of understanding what this means is that de facto we have a plurality of methods that we use and a plurality of concepts of cause that are in use. Okay, the fact that descriptively we are in this pluralistic situation does not imply that there is a total anarchy in what you use when and that you would be allowed to use whatever whenever you want. Okay, this is where a first normative aspect comes in. It is crucial to specify what your research question is and what kind of possibly causal relation you are trying to dig out. And it is also the case that in some domains, we work more with certain concepts of cause and less with other concepts of cause. So if you tell me that your interest is in impact assessment, for me, immediately, this means that you want to know whether a certain intervention has the effect that you were planning, okay? So that means that you are not looking for causes of effects, but you are kind of evaluating whether the causes kind of deliver the right effects, okay? This implies already one way of working with causality. It is not so much, for instance, counterfactual. It is very factual, okay? You may be working a lot with causal mechanisms because you may want to say how it is the case that this type of intervention led or did not lead to this cause. So you have to be able to specify causal paths that did or did not take place. In this case, maybe there isn't such a difference with the causal processes, and that's a problem that Wouter had, and the devil is in the detail, but let's say that prima facie, you may treat them as similar, prima facie, I would say. It also means, I would say, that this kind of restricts the type of methods that you're allowed to use and those that are less useful, okay? It also means that you may have to mix some quantitative methods and some qualitative oriented methods, and you may want to hold comparisons with similar interventions run somewhere else, okay? So for me, the key is that for any given domain or any given problem, we have to specify which concepts, which methods, how they work, and why something is more apt or less apt than others. And so this gives me my initial answer. But of course, we can give a much longer answer and depend on how the discussion goes, and we can continue this one-to-one if you want.
Thank you.
Wouter, anything to add to that?
Well, I thinking about this causal pluralism. I do believe that in the end, from a philosophical point of view, it might be possible to have like a singular kind of cause. I recently read a paper. I think it was by Hodgson in 2006. I think he makes the claim. Well, everything is reducible to transfer of material and energy in the end. I don't know if that's true or if I completely agree with that. But even if that's true, it's very often unpractical for most of the questions that we have to, reason in terms of causes like that. So for many questions, we need to think about other types of causes. In his view, all those causes should be reducible to transfer of material energy. But for my purposes, it's very often much more useful to think about causal analysis in terms of intentions of people, for example. And, if there's something deeper underlying that is not really that interesting, or it's at least unpractical to try to uncover that. So in that sense, I think you need different concepts of causes for different kinds of research questions. Well, maybe even fundamentally they are, one is reducible to another. But is that important? Do I really care enough to figure out that question, whether that's really true? I don't think so, because in practice, it's not really useful for me.
Thank you so much, Wouter. I have some thoughts about that one. But first, Roel, then Emil, then Judith.
Okay, thank you. I had actually two brief points, and the first one I'll address it to Wouter because he mentioned the idea of mechanisms. Now, I would argue that mechanisms requires that at some level, reality works as fixed things in working in fixed ways. Otherwise, there's no point talking about mechanisms. Well, when I look at social reality, I see heterogeneity, I see emergence, I see diversity. So is mechanism really a good metaphor to talk about causality in the social reality? That's a question I would like to pose to you. And the second, I'll pose that then to Federica. Most of the methods, philosophies that talk about causality in terms of the actuality of the outcome. We need to establish a robust connection between a cause and an outcome. What do you think about turning that around and thinking about causality as the potentiality of the cause? Does the cause make it possible for an outcome to occur without it really being very important if the outcome actually occurs, yes or no? Just demonstrating, arguing, making it plausible that it's possible might be just as well, at least in the social science context. Just some thoughts from you on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Roel. Wouter first, then Federica.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with you that this mechanism metaphor assumes a kind of like a fixed structure to reality, and that's also what's funny is that when they try to explain the metaphor, they always use really mechanical metaphors, right? Like the engine of a car breaking down. But if you try to come up with an explanation or an example that really refers to more like a social reality, I think it's much harder to come up with a good example. So I agree that it's not the most, how do you say, I think the metaphor is not always appropriate. I do use the terminology quite often. Again, I'm a bit of a pragmatist. This is some, a way that people like to talk about it. But there's one definition of mechanisms by Elster that allows for a little bit more wiggle room, where it's frequently recurring patterns, under certain conditions with certain outcomes, and those conditions and outcomes are very often not known from the beginning. And those frequently recurring patterns is what I'm interested in, you could say. So, and that also means that very often they do not occur. And I mean, there's many other things in this causal mechanism thinking that I have problems with. For example, the way that Abel looks at the connections between actions, he always he still thinks in terms of a kind of push causality, an efficient causality, right? How one action leads to another. Well, I think it's much more useful to think about how people respond to certain events, and they can respond in different ways. And I mean, it's a subtle difference maybe, but it does change, you know, for me, it shifts the thinking a little bit from, you know, once this happens, then always something else happens to, you know, you can only say in hindsight, you can only explain in hindsight why certain people responded to certain events in a certain way, but it doesn't tell you anything about how they would respond to a similar situation, you know, further on, or it tells you something, but it doesn't give you any certainty.
If only humans were rocks, it would have been so much easier. Federica, please.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion, Rula. So my first reaction is that I guess that what you are meaning here with the actuality of the outcome and potentiality of the cause is something quite different from what is usually understood especially in statistics, when they distinguish between the effect of causes and the causes of the effect. My second reaction would be that you may need actually both approaches. You see, I am uncomfortable with the idea that all you need is to study the actuality of the outcome, because there will be so many cases in which you may want to anticipate, figure out what a given cause may give rise to, and this is where you explore the potentiality of the cause, you see. So for me, I mean, and I go back to the idea of pluralism, I would like to know, given your specific research question or domain, why you need to study more the potentiality of the cause rather than the actuality of the outcome, and most likely to study one or the other. You're going to favor some methodologies over others. And for me, this is perfectly legitimate. So I totally agree that you need to study the potentiality of the cause. I just wouldn't want to rule out entirely the actuality of the outcome when it is needed. And if I am allowed to 10 seconds more, Lasse.
Sure, go ahead.
I think because I think your worry about mechanisms are really real. The philosophy of mechanisms in the past 10 to 15 years has really helped a lot, because they really try to liberate this concept of mechanism from a mechanicistic idea, so the clock metaphor. And there is an approach by Hilary and Glennon, and they gave this minimal definition of mechanism as entities and activities that are organized in such a way to produce a given phenomenon. I don't have the exact quote. And it is so minimal and so liberal that you can apply it more easily to social context than the kind of mechanism metaphor that you're used to. And I'm happy to give you more references on this if you find it somehow useful or inspiring.
Would be helpful. Thank you both. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And maybe Federica, you can share it in the chat if you have it there, else we can do it later at some later stage. And while Federica's looking it up, I would like to give room to Emil to ask his questions, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I've got I think a question to Wouter, and I'm also interested in, of course, what Federica has to say about it. But what I missed in your presentation is something about sequence. So I did a comparative case study of two regions, one in the UK, one in Germany, two old industrial regions which went through a process of deindustrialization, and then I looked at the role of institutions that institution played in that, and then I made a lot in my study about the sequence of events. So how do you go from institutions and how they are organized and what functions they perform, to what policies are enacted and what effects these policies have, and how this then has an effect in the economy. So anyway, so that's sort of the causal process, and then makes it plausible, I think, to go from one to another, and then you do a comparison as well. So anyway, there's, I think there's information in the sequence of events, and I didn't really see that in your presentation. So I was wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah.
There we go, Wouter.
Yeah, I think that so a more sequential approach to analyzing processes is, I guess it's kind of different from the approach that Abel takes. I find both interesting, right? So, and there's actually, Abbott wrote quite a lot about how his work, which is more on sequence-based methods, compares to the work of Abel, for example. And Abbott basically makes the argument, people like Abel are too worried about these, small links between events. All that really matters is the order of events, or that's the most interesting about studying processes, and that's a little bit different, I guess, from in my view, that's a little bit different from causal analysis, because what you do then, and I think you still need to do that in a comparative way, is to say something about, does the order in which events happen, does that matter for what kind of outcome comes out of that? And I think there's just a different kind of question than what Abel is trying to tackle, which is more about, okay, if you are studying a process and you're making claims about that events are related to each other and eventually lead up to something, then you need to justify those claims. You need to somehow justify that those events are linked to each other. And that's something I think you don't necessarily explicitly do when you do something like a sequence analysis. It's left a little bit more implicit that these events are indeed, causally related to each other.
But if you want, it also builds on what Roel asked. I think it's sort of you're maybe presupposing some kind of necessity in these things, and then the sequence confirms that these things are necessarily related.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just. I don't know. I think Abbott made this argument that these events are related to each other can be related to each other in so many different ways, right? There's so many different possible linkages that can relate events to each other, that he basically, it's not really the way he said it, I guess, but he says he didn't bother about making all of those links explicit. And he said it's also, his interest was mostly in the effect of order of events, right? And that's a little bit different from an interest in the exact relationship between all these events. And he says, well, there are many different relationships between these events. It's not that important for what he was interested in. So very useful for a different kind of purpose. And I sort of stayed away from sequence analysis because the kind of processes that I study, and that's a different kind of problem that I have with sequence analysis. It's very hard to use sequence methodology to study processes where many different things happen at the same time alongside each other that are not always interrelated, right? Where things branch out or converge. And then sequence methodology makes it quite hard to really make sense of that. So that's why I got interested in this more, these narrative networks kind of things. And from there, I got into these complicated discussions about how do you then, justify these linkages. So.
Does that answer the question, Emil?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it answers the question, but I mean, there's it at least, it raised new issues, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Judith, please.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentations. I have a question to Wouter, and also a remark, and again related to mechanisms, because one of the things you also said is that mechanisms and causality assumes that cases are homogeneous. And the problem in practice is they are not. And so what I think has been a step forward is indeed in post-positivist approaches, for example, in education where I look at, it's often the case that they ask, okay, does, for example, smaller classes cause better achievement? But for example, Paulson and Tilly, from a realist perspective, they ask the question, what works for whom under which circumstances? And in both cases, you are still looking at mechanisms, but in an entirely different way. And I think that what Paulson and Tilly, what they propose with that method, so to speak, that question, you get nearer to understanding something of the situation, for example, of how an intervention works, because it will work for some, but not for others. And that's because there are differences, and studying these differences is great. And so I'm always surprised that so much of educational research still is about that one variable that causes another variable. And I also know, for example, Spielman, who says that it's related to another problem, which is that if you have a kind of a mechanism at the level of a group, that does not necessarily mean you have the same mechanism at the level of the individual. And that's one of the errors that's often made, for example, in psychology. So yeah, but I still think that mechanisms are useful, and in that sense, I also have a remark to Federica, because what I read, for example, about some new materialist analyses, they really refrain from mechanisms, and they say no, mechanisms do not cause anything. So, for example, nothing is caused by, say, neoliberalism or patriarchy or whatever, but rather mechanisms are the things to be explained. But then my question to them is, okay, but apparently that means that mechanisms have some use, because you cannot say mechanisms are completely unimportant, because if they are the thing to be explained, then they have a very useful role. So yeah, those were my my remarks. Questions.
Thanks, thanks, Judith. Maybe Federica first, and then Wouter, please.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. So I'll try to address your comment from the side. So it seems to me that here we are trying to answer two different questions simultaneously, and they should be disentangled. One question is, what is causality at the metaphysical level? What is the ultimately the reality of causes? And you may have different views. So you can say that causal production is what is out there in the world, but what is production, of course, is not settled in stone, okay? And then there is a question that is at the epistemological and methodological level, and the question is, how do you find out what causes what, okay? So I would resist the idea that what you have just out there in the world are mechanisms, as if, you know, the mechanism of the clock is something that is out there in the world, and this is the mechanism of protein synthesis. This is the mechanism explaining education and future earning related to social class, etc. No. The function of a causal mechanism is really epistemic, you know, because it is how you explain or to repeat or to take an idea that Wouter was trying to get at, is how you give the evidence for, you know, it is really how you make this link kind of sound from your narrative perspective, okay? So I really would step back with respect to these bold metaphysical claims. Of course, there is a question about metaphysics, and I want to cite it as much as I can. And then I say how it is that I establish these things. And this is where, for me, talking about mechanisms becomes useful and can be informative, as long as there is a very minimal metaphysical commitment about what they are. And I could give you more details of all these things, but I hope this somehow helps a bit.
Thanks, Federica. Wouter, please.
Yeah, I think well, what to say? Yeah,
Do you need more thinking time?
Yeah, well, the way I sort of got into this mechanism thinking, so I'm not someone who does this step from correlational studies and then trying to establish, you know, to account for this correlation through a mechanism. The way I got into this is that I'm interested in the processes themselves. And I've sort of felt this urge that I need to somehow, how do I account for all these relationships that I draw in sort of telling a narrative? And how do I go further than what we usually do when we write up the narrative and try to make a convincing story? And I guess that was sort of my way to that's how I found my way to this literature, in which people thought about, you know, how do we actually establish that these things are indeed related to each other, that there's some kind of causal mechanism here. I don't really subscribe to the idea that what you then establish, right, if you find a causal mechanism, that this is a fact once and for all. That's also why I sort of refer to this idea of Elster, of frequently recurring patterns, because that's sort of, for me, a kind of looser way to talk about mechanisms that's still meaningful in the sense, okay, these are things that frequently occur, right? These are interesting patterns that may account for some of the things that we observe, but they may very well not occur. I mean, and I think, yeah, it's still, you know, it still causes problems for generalization, I guess, because there's always this margin of uncertainty. Is this a mechanism that I establish in one case? Yeah, you know, I don't know. I think I get a little bit stuck here, but yeah.
That's perfectly fine. And see, Federica comes to the rescue.
I think you have the impression that you get stuck because somehow when I hear you speaking about this, I have the impression that you're still trapped in this. There are causal laws that are general and universal, and my problem is how do I establish the particular, no? But of course, in social science, we don't have these laws. At most, we have some sorts of generalizations, but then what, you see? But if you kind of get out of this dichotomy, you know, yes, there are things that works for most cases and some that are really just one-off, and that's what the world is like. Then you just try to understand, how do I establish the narrative in a cogent way? And if it is that you want to establish a generalization, you need certain tools. And if you need to establish a single case, you need other tools. And these are the grounds on which I want to believe you or not when you tell me this story. But it's not because you have a generic mechanism and then the question is, does this specific problem I'm studying, is this the kind of the particular of the generic? I have no idea. I would say just get out of this.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree that I'm still stuck with. I mean, I don't believe that we should be able to subsume the relationships that we find under covering laws. I do believe that we need some kind of to make progress in our understanding of how, you know, things relate to each other. We need some kind of, it's not really generalizability. There's this other idea that I found quite intriguing that was developed by innovation scholars that studied process, where they called it more like versatility. So do we have a certain kind of explanation, a certain pattern that we can easily adapt to different sort of contexts to explain what is going on? And that's, I think, maybe also an interesting way to think about causal mechanisms and their value for explanations in different situations. So is it versatile enough to account for very different scenarios? And I think that's still, you know, for me, there's still something valuable in in trying to generalize in that kind of way, because then you find explanations that are not only useful in a one-off situation, which I think is still something that we should strive for.
I agree. I agree on this. But you see, now your starting point is not from the assumption that there must be a causal law that works in the social realm, just as we think we have a universal physics law. Now you reason more in terms of patterns that may be useful or versatile in different situations, and that is a more useful idea, because then you don't get it trapped into this deterministic view, etc. And you can say why you need to generalize. You may need to generalize because, for instance, you want to set up policies out of that, or because you might want to come up with a general theory of a given problem. That's why you need it, but it's not that you need it in the absolute.
No, and I should maybe also clarify that this approach to causal analysis that I started out with is not something that I necessarily. I mean, that's not something I've ever done myself, that approach. Like I said, I don't do these correlational studies myself. And I don't necessarily agree with all the positions that they take there. But I found the kind of discussion that they end up with, I found quite intriguing. And somehow I felt it's relevant for the way I go about doing my own research. I also just found it funny that it sort of shows, I think demonstrates quite nicely how we get into these weird discussions when we talk about causal analysis on a case level, right? We get into strange solutions to make certain causal claims, or we start using strange terminology to sort of avoid having to have that discussion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Then it becomes all semantic in the end. Yeah. Thanks. Any last questions to our panelists? The power of the chair is that I can do it myself. So I had a question about the final cause, but I don't dare to ask that anymore. I have another question particularly to Federica regarding foliated pluralism, and I'll play the devil's advocate for Federica, because the claim is that the type of causal statements that you want to generate depends on what you're looking at, and there are different angles in which you can approach the same object, and so far so good. But it also sounds to me it's almost like the Dutch approach to research, namely there must be a pluralist consensus somewhere. If we all give and take a bit, then ultimately we'll find something that is workable enough. As I said, devil's advocate. And I was wondering, how do you know what to do if you don't understand your object in the first place? Because we deploy our tools, our research methods, to understand an object better. And if we can do this through this pluralism that is tailored to the object, then we have to understand the object better. So I'm getting stuck in a loop where I need to understand the object that I want to look at in order to know what methods I need in order to understand the object that I'm looking at. How should I get out of this loop, Federica?
You don't get out of the loop. I mean, history of science has taught us that we may have a very wrong way of looking at an object, and then subsequently using other methods or a different idea, then we understand that it was not what we thought of. I mean, that's why I want to stick with some form of pluralism that is not anarchist after all. Also because I want to acknowledge that, we are fallible, we make mistakes, and we may make huge mistakes in the first moments we approach a new subject matter. And so we have to remain critical about the methods that we use, and open to the criticism that we may be using really the wrong tool for that kind of object we think is the object we want to study.
Exactly. Thank you so much. I feel happier now. Thank you. It's this warm and fuzzy feeling, or maybe it's just fever. I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of this very fascinating hour. A big thanks to both Federica and Wouter for fascinating talks and very good Q&A. I really enjoyed it a lot. So thanks a lot for that.